Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today, um, we're going to tackle something I think a lot of us throw around, but maybe don't think super hard about: globalization. And I think it's especially interesting for a philosopher like you to consider all the aspects of globalization.
You're right. Globalization, it is one of those words that seems simple enough at first glance, but the more you dig into it, the more complex and multifaceted it really becomes.
Exactly. And to kind of wade through all of this, we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on globalization. Fair warning, though, it is a pretty dense read, so that's what we're here for, to break it down into something we can all digest a little easier.
Yeah, hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better grasp on it and maybe even rethink some of your assumptions about the world.
Okay, so first things first. The Stanford Encyclopedia makes it really clear that globalization isn't just some, like trendy buzzword that people throw around to you to sound smart. Philosophers and social theorists have been grappling with these ideas for a very long time.
Yeah, it's true. And one of the fascinating things is that even though the term globalization itself is relatively recent, the forces driving it have been shaping human societies for centuries.
Okay, so that begs the question, what is globalization? How do philosophers actually define it?
Well, at its core, globalization refers to a fundamental shift in how we experience space and time. With near instant communication, rapid travel, the constant flow of information, physical location starts to become less and less important.
Okay, I can see that.
It's almost like the world is shrinking, and that has huge implications for how we think about things like politics, ethics, and even, our own identity.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense, but it's still a little bit
Yeah.
abstract. Can you give me a real-world example of how this shrinking world thing plays out in real life?
Sure, think about the rise of e-commerce. You can buy practically anything from anywhere in the world with a few clicks. That's a pretty tangible manifestation of globalization, right? Or consider international academic collaborations. Scientists, researchers from different continents can work together on complex projects without ever needing to be in the same physical location.
Yeah, good point. I mean, this must have huge consequences for philosophers, especially when considering something like ethical debates.
Wait, like if location matters less and less, how do we even redefine our responsibilities to one another? And these aren't new questions either.
It really seems like the old boundaries are kind of breaking down.
Yeah.
But is this really a new phenomenon? I mean, haven't people always been connected across vast distances?
Yeah.
Even going back to ancient times?
Yeah, you're right. Globalization isn't something that just suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The Stanford Encyclopedia points out some really interesting historical examples of thinkers wrestling with these very ideas. Yeah, like take Karl Marx, for example. Back in the mid-19th century, he was already talking about capitalism's tendency to spread and interconnect nations. He even said that capitalism compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. I mean, that's pretty insightful for a guy writing over 150 years ago.
Yeah, it definitely shows that these questions about interconnectedness and the impact of, global forces have been on people's minds for a long time. But how does the Stanford Encyclopedia actually break down the different aspects of globalization? I mean, like, what are the key components that they identify?
They actually outline several core dimensions to help us understand this complex phenomenon. We've already talked about one of them, deterritorialization, which is just a fancy way of saying that activities and relationships are increasingly detached from specific physical locations. Another key dimension is interconnectedness.
Okay, so not just that things are becoming more placeless, but that a distant event can have a much greater impact on what's happening locally.
Exactly. So it's not just that I can order a book online from across the world, but that a political decision in one country can have a ripple effect and affect the price of that book or even its availability. And this obviously raises all sorts of questions about responsibility, power dynamics, and the limits of national sovereignty. Things we'll get into a bit later. But first, there's another crucial dimension to consider: speed.
Ah, yes, speed. It does feel like everything's moving faster and faster these days. Information products, people, everything's accelerating.
Right. Globalization has this feeling of everything being on fast forward. It's not an accident, though, that velocity is built into the system.
Mm.
And it's not just about technology either. It's about how we organize our economies, our political systems, even our personal lives. It changes everything.
So globalization isn't just some abstract idea. It's something we're all participating in, shaping and being shaped by every single day.
Exactly. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Globalization isn't just one thing. It's multifaceted. It has economic, political, cultural dimensions, each with their own unique dynamics and conflicts.
Okay, so it's not just about ordering things online or watching foreign films. It's about how all of these different aspects of globalization are interacting and influencing each other,
Yeah.
and how that impacts our lives in much deeper ways.
You got it. And that complexity is what makes globalization such a fascinating and at times daunting topic for philosophers to grapple with. It really forces us to rethink some of our most fundamental assumptions about how the world works.
Okay, so we've talked about how globalization is this huge force that's shrinking the world, speeding everything up, blurring the lines between here and there. That's already a lot to think about, but for a philosopher like you, this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because if those old categories of like domestic and foreign, us versus them, if those are breaking down, then what does that mean for all those huge philosophical questions about, justice and democracy, the role of the state?
You're absolutely right. Globalization throws a real wrench into a lot of classic Western political thought, which, often relies on these very neat categories of domestic and foreign us and them.
Right? Like those were fixed categories or something. Globalization makes that kind of thinking seem very outdated.
It does, doesn't it? And that's why the Stanford Encyclopedia spends so much time on the philosophical challenges that globalization brings up. And I think one of the biggest sticking points is the whole concept of justice.
Okay, yeah, let's dig into that.
Mm.
How does globalization complicate our ideas about what's just or fair?
Well, you see, traditional theories of justice often focus on how things are distributed within a specific society. Like how should wealth and resources be divided among citizens within a nation state? But globalization makes it much harder to ignore the vast inequalities that exist between countries.
So we're almost forced to expand our moral horizons to consider the well-being of people far beyond our own communities.
Exactly. And the Stanford Encyclopedia actually highlights this, the link between growing global inequality and the rising inequality we're seeing within wealthy nations. It's not just about what's happening within our own borders anymore when decisions made in one country can have such a profound impact on people's lives halfway across the globe. And this is where that tension between cosmopolitanism and communitarianism becomes really important.
Ah, yes, the classic debate. So for those of us who aren't philosophy experts, can you break down what those terms actually mean? I mean, how do these two perspectives view justice in this, globalized world we live in?
Sure. So cosmopolitans basically believe that we have moral obligations to all human beings, regardless of where they live. So they would argue that global distributive justice is a moral imperative. It's essential to address these vast global inequalities, even if it means, redistributing wealth from richer to poorer countries.
So for cosmopolitans, national borders are almost irrelevant when it comes to questions of justice.
Pretty much, yeah. But then on the other side, you have the communitarians who prioritize the nation state and its community. Their argument is that we have stronger obligations to our fellow citizens than to those in other countries.
So they would be more skeptical of those global redistribution schemes, even if it's meant to, alleviate extreme poverty.
Yeah.
It's like they're drawing a circle around the nation state and saying that's where our primary moral obligations lie.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it's not just about wealth and resources either. Think about things like climate change, human rights violations, global pandemics. These problems don't respect national borders.
Right. It's like globalization is throwing all these interconnected problems at us, and our traditional ways of thinking about justice just aren't equipped to handle them.
Yeah.
So how do we even begin to think about justice in a world where everything is so interconnected?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it leads to the next big challenge that the Stanford Encyclopedia brings up: democracy. If globalization is blurring the lines between domestic and foreign affairs, what happens to our ability to govern ourselves democratically?
That's something I'm sure you've thought about a lot as a philosopher, because democracy, at least how we think about it today, has always been tied to the nation state.
Absolutely. We elect representatives to make decisions on our behalf within our own countries. But what happens when those decisions are increasingly shaped by global forces and events that are totally outside of our control? Does that undermine the whole idea of democratic self-governance?
It's like if so much is being decided on a global level where we have very little influence, do our votes even matter anymore?
It's a fear that a lot of people have, and the Stanford Encyclopedia actually lays out two main perspectives on this. On the one hand, you have those who argue that we need to extend democratic principles to the global level.
So they'd be in favor of some form of global democracy. That sounds pretty ambitious.
It is, yeah. And there are different reasons why people support this idea. Some believe we need global democratic mechanisms to actually deal with those transnational challenges like climate change. Others would say it's necessary to maintain popular sovereignty in a world where nation states are, increasingly constrained by global forces. So you see things like proposals to strengthen international organizations like the UN, create transnational parliaments, even holding global referendums on certain issues.
Yeah, I can see the appeal of that, especially for those big problems that obviously require global cooperation. But I imagine the practical challenges would be huge. How do you actually create a democratic system that encompasses such a diverse world with, billions of people, different cultures, languages, political systems?
And that's exactly the counterargument. Those who are skeptical of global democracy say it's just not feasible. They argue that democracy requires this shared sense of identity, common values, a level of trust that just doesn't exist on a global scale.
It's like trying to have a town hall meeting with billions of people.
Yeah.
Exactly. They worry that imposing democratic institutions on such a diverse world could actually lead to more conflict and less effective governance.
They'd say it's better to focus on strengthening democracy within nation states and then find ways for those states to cooperate on the global stage, based on mutual interest and respect for national sovereignty.
So on one hand, we need some form of global governance to deal with these huge transnational challenges. But on the other hand, achieving true democracy at that level seems incredibly difficult. It's a real dilemma.
It is a dilemma, and to make things even more complicated, you have the resurgence of these nationalist and populist movements, many of which are rejecting global governance altogether and calling for a return to national sovereignty.
So it's like we're at this crossroads trying to figure out how to navigate this increasingly interconnected world while also holding on to those values of democracy and justice that are, so central to our political traditions.
Hmm.
So what do we do? What's the way forward?
Yeah, that is the question, isn't it? And to be honest, the Stanford Encyclopedia doesn't really give us any easy answers. It's more about laying out, those key tensions and getting us to think critically about what the potential solutions might be.
So it's not really a roadmap. It's more like a toolkit for navigating this really complex landscape.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the most important tools in that toolkit, I think, is recognizing the limitations of our current ways of thinking. We can't just keep applying the same old frameworks to a world that's fundamentally changed.
Okay, so let's say we're willing to, think outside the box a little bit. What are some of the concrete challenges that we need to address? Where do we even start?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is figuring out how to balance the need for global cooperation with, the legitimate claims of national sovereignty. As a philosopher, I'm sure you're familiar with the tension between individual rights and the common good, and this is kind of a similar dynamic, but on a global scale.
It's like walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
We need to address these huge global issues that no single nation can solve on its own. But we also don't want to create some kind of, unaccountable global superstate that runs roughshod over the rights and autonomy of individual countries.
Exactly. It's a very tricky balancing act. And that ties into another really important question. How do we make sure that any form of global governance is both effective and accountable?
Yeah, that's a big one. It's easy to imagine a scenario where global institutions become too powerful and completely out of touch with the people they're supposed to be serving. I mean, we've seen that happen even at the national level with big bureaucracies.
Right. So if we are going to create institutions that operate beyond the nation state,
Hmm.
we need to be really careful about how we structure them. They have to be responsive to the needs of, very diverse communities, but
Yeah.
they also need to be subject to some form of democratic oversight.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But the thing is, there's no instruction manual for global democracy, right? There's no existing model that we can just copy and paste. It's like we're in uncharted territory here.
That's what makes this whole era so challenging, but also so exciting. We have this opportunity and maybe even a responsibility to shape the future of global governance in a way that reflects our values and, our hopes for the future.
It's daunting, but inspiring at the same time. So from your perspective, what are some of the key principles that should guide us as we're, trying to grapple with all of this?
I think the concept of global citizenship is really crucial. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that what we do has consequences for people all over the world, not just, within our own borders. It means acknowledging that we have a shared responsibility for the well-being of all human beings, not just those who share our nationality.
It's about expanding our moral circle to encompass the whole world, not just us versus them, but a more expansive sense of we.
Exactly. And that principle can inform how we approach all these global issues, poverty, inequality, Climate change, human rights, it can help us move beyond, just narrow self-interest and work towards a world that's more just and equitable for everyone.
That's a really powerful idea, but it also seems very abstract. How do we actually turn that principle into, real concrete action?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, and that's where the work of philosophers like you is so important. We need creative solutions, new models of global governance, new ways to ensure accountability at the global level.
It's like we need to rethink the very idea of politics in this age of globalization, a new political philosophy for a world without borders.
Exactly. And that's a challenge worthy of our best efforts.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, the history of globalization to the really big philosophical questions it raises. It's definitely given me, and I hope everyone listening, a lot to think about.
Yeah, and it's clear that there are no easy answers. Globalization is complex, messy, and constantly evolving. But as we've been talking about, by having these difficult conversations, by questioning our assumptions, and being willing to embrace new ways of thinking, we can start to figure out a path forward.
A path toward a more just equitable and democratic world.
Hmm.
So to all philosophers out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, keep diving deep. And we'll be back next time with another fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious.